What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today I want to talk about something a little different than we've been doing recently on the channel, because recently we've been talking about stuff that makes sense in terms of the lead up to the Nintendo Switch 2, saying goodbye to the Nintendo Switch, talking about Switch 2 next-gen upgrades for certain Switch 1 games. But this topic isn't something that's going to be relevant at launch, but a little bit after, and that is the Switch 2 lineup from launch day to the end of the year. Now, there's been some discourse online about how the Switch 2's lineup for this year is a bit underwhelming, and part of me does agree with that on the whole. There aren't that many Switch 2 exclusive games that we know of coming out in the first 6 months of the system's life. But I also can't agree with that because the system is launching with Mario Kart, and then a month later we're getting DK. So to suggest that this is an underwhelming lineup, I think is a bit unfair to the new console. However, like I said, on the whole, the lineup does feel a little light, especially after DK Bonanza drops on July 17th. So I want to pose this question, and feel free to answer it in the comments. If what we know is the Switch 2's lineup for the first 6 months of its life, would you be happy? I suppose it's the first 7 months, to be fair. June, July, August, September, October, November, December. That's 7. Big math guy over here. But, and I'm going to read it in a second, would you be satisfied with the lineup that Nintendo has laid out for 2025 for the Switch 2? I think it's an interesting conversation, and it's why I wonder if there are a few more secrets that Nintendo is hiding that might get revealed in June Nintendo Direct. But today's video is more about lining up the Switch 2's 2025 release schedule and seeing where there might be some holes. I'm not necessarily going to make predictions because we'll do a June Direct prediction video eventually. This is more so analyzing what we know so far and talking about some minor leaks and things that have come out since that Nintendo Switch 2 Direct in April. But let's talk about what Nintendo told us in terms of the Switch 2's release schedule. Obviously, Mario Kart World is coming out on June 5th, then Donkey Kong Bonanza comes out a few weeks later on July 17th. A week after that, Mario Party Jamboree is getting a Switch 2 edition. Dragon Drive coming summer 2025. They didn't give us a date for that yet. Kirby and the Forgotten Land Switch 2 edition comes out August 28th. I'd imagine Dragon Drive comes out before that. Kirby Air Riders just has a 2025 date, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment was given a 2025 date at the Direct, but later in a update to investors, they did list it as a winter 2025 game. And of course, we have two new Switch 1 games getting Switch 2 editions, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond and Pokemon Legends ZA, which each have a 2025 release date. I think Pokemon had a window of late 2025, but again, very vague, and we don't know much about when that might come out. So as it stands right now, that is the rest of 2025 for Nintendo. And maybe this is just me being greedy, but it does feel a little bit light, considering that the first 6 months of the year, or I guess first 5 months of the year, remember that counting we did, was very light. We only got Donkey Kong Country Returns HD and Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. That's a 3DS port and a Wii U port, and that's it for the first 5 months of 2025. That is the lightest 5 months I would imagine Nintendo has had in the Switch generation. And obviously they get a pass because the new system is coming out. It's understandable why the cadence slowed down this year, but it does make you feel like there should be a big blowout for Nintendo in the last 7 months of the year. And to an extent, that is happening with Mario Kart World and DK Bonanza, which should be big games. But then it's a lot of stuff that is exciting, but isn't the biggest. Pokemon Legends ZA should be included in that really big release category. It's going to sell like a gazillion units. But past that, you've got Dragon Drive, which is a very niche, casual kind of game Nintendo's developing. You've got Kirby Air Riders, which again is a very exciting release. It's a very important release for Nintendo because it's Sakurai's first non-Smash game in over a decade, but it's not a game that's going to get a huge fan base, especially with Nintendo's most popular racing franchise coming out just a few months before it. And then Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, which yes, is a Zelda game, and that's a big franchise for Nintendo, but the Hyrule Warriors games don't usually sell more than a few million copies per year. So that's not a huge release either, I would say, for Nintendo. And then Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, which again is a very important franchise, but is also a very niche franchise. And I think Metroid Prime 4 Beyond will be the best-selling Metroid game, but even that would only put it at like, what, 3.5 million units sold? Metroid isn't a very popular series. As much as it is a hardcore Nintendo franchise. And look, I don't think anyone thinks Nintendo is done announcing games. They always have a few announcements for every Direct, and usually at June Directs, they have a few games announced that come out very soon thereafter. But those new announcements might just be Switch 1 games, right? There was a whole Switch 2 Direct to get people hyped for the Nintendo Switch 2. If there was a big game they were holding back, why would they not just tell us about it? Or even if there was a medium-sized game they were holding back, why would they not just tell us about it? Well, I have a theory about that, and we'll get into it in a bit, but it makes more sense to do in a later section of this video when we go through Nintendo's projected release schedule with predicted dates by me, and look for some holes in the schedule to where we could see some announcements for Nintendo. But first, I want to talk about something that broke, I think, last week. Arc System Works, the popular fighting game dev studio, had a big leak. I'm not going to give any links to, information and pictures and all of that stuff. I'm not going to give any links to information or show you pictures or any of that stuff because A, I think they're cracking down really hard on this, and that's understandable, and B, there was probably some sensitive information that was included in this leak. I don't want to lead anyone to someone's phone number or home address or something. So we're just going to talk about this. If you're interested, I'm sure you can find the pictures online and everything. But Arc System Works did have a leak, and information about two games that seem to be Switch or Switch 2 exclusives were found. The first one I think is less interesting. It's called Project Life. It has Another Code / Hotel Dusk vibes. Remember, Arc System Works did Another Code Recollection on Switch last year. And from the leaked images, it looks really good. Like, it looks really cool. The art style is great, but it supposedly is only a hour to a few hour long kind of game. It's not a meaty visual novel like Another Code was, where you had those two games, and I believe the second one is like super long. This is a very small game that apparently Arc System Works is working on. I'm still excited for it if it is indeed real, but it's not something that really factors into Nintendo's release schedule. This will probably just be a Switch game that doesn't even get a Switch 2 edition. You can just play it on your Switch 2 if you want. But the second game I think is far more interesting for this discussion, and that's Project Watari. Apparently, Watari translates to cross in Japanese. I'm gonna take all of your words for it that that's what it translates to. Who knows? But if that's the case, people are theorizing that it's some sort of fighting game for Nintendo that might even be a crossover between certain franchises. Again, Arc System Works is known for their 2D fighting games, so it would make sense that after making a game for Nintendo last year, Nintendo would say, hey, that game looked pretty good, why don't you make us a 2D fighter with some of our IPs? And the one title that people immediately went to as what this could be is a Xenoblade Cross Fire Emblem 2D fighter. For the record, there is no indication, as far as I'm aware, that this game has any relation to Xenoblade or Fire Emblem. I think people were just really hoping that's what it would be, and they kind of jumped to a conclusion there. Look, that would be amazing. Even if it was just a Xenoblade fighter, I would die for that. But a Xenoblade times Fire Emblem 2D fighter with Arc System Works stylish, vibrant art style that they use for their 2D fighting games would be unbelievable to have on the Switch 2, maybe even in 120 FPS. Ooh, I don't know, but that does seem a little bit hopeful. Like, I don't know, that seems like something you would see in a fake Nintendo Direct leak on 4chan, and you look at it and you're like, that is the most unrealistic thing ever. Why would that ever happen? So I don't know if Xenoblade times Fire Emblem is actually real, but it does make a lot of sense if this is indeed a crossover fighting game with Nintendo characters. Some people also speculated that it could be a new Project X Zone game, which was a series of games on the 3DS that took all sorts of Capcom and Bandai characters and put them together. And I think the gameplay was that of a tactical RPG with some fighting elements. I didn't play the game myself, so I don't really remember. But there were some rumors floating around before the Switch 2 got revealed, I believe, or maybe in between the time the Switch 2 got revealed and the Switch 2 Direct, that Monolith Soft was involved in the development of a new Project X Zone game. Now, of course, Monolith Soft made the first two Project X Zone games, so that would make sense, but I believe the rumor also said that it was going to involve Nintendo characters. Now, I might have just hallucinated this because I can't find anything online about this rumor, but I've seen other people bring it up when discussing Project Watari and what it could be. So I'm gonna assume that someone along the line leaked this game and I'm not just imagining it. So some people think it could be Project X Zone 3 with Nintendo characters this time. But what if it's Nintendo X Zone? A Project X Zone game just with Nintendo characters. I believe that was the rumor that was floating around, was that it was going to be a Project X Zone game, but exclusively Nintendo characters developed by Monolith. Again, I could just be imagining that. Maybe I saw it in a dream. If you remember this rumor, please tell me in the comments, because I feel like I'm going insane. If you Google this, nothing comes up. So I want someone to validate me in remembering this rumor existing. So please tell me in the comments if you remember this going around, and if there's any other information I missed, let me know. I think a Nintendo X Zone game could be interesting, even though Arc System Works did not work on the first two Project X Zone games. I believe that was Monolith and Bandai Namco, because people were assuming this was a fighting game because it was in Unreal Engine 5, and that's where Arc System Works makes all of their fighting games. But maybe that's just the development software that Arc System Works is the most comfortable with. If they were going to make any sort of big Switch 2 game, even if it wasn't a 2D fighter, they'd probably use that engine because they're comfortable with it and they want to make it an easier transition to the new console. I don't know. I'm not a game developer, but that's kind of my 2 cents on that. So it could certainly be Nintendo X Zone or something to that effect, or something completely different that none of us are expecting. But the reason this is in conversation with the video today is that the leaked date for this is November 2025, which would give Nintendo at least another Switch 2 game this fall, even if this isn't going to be a huge game. Look, if it's Xenoblade times Fire Emblem Fighters, I will be stoked for that. I know a lot of Nintendo fans will be stoked for that. That game's not going to blow anyone's socks off. It's not going to light the world on fire. If it's a Nintendo X Zone game, maybe that's a different story, because anything with Mario on the cover usually sells well. And by the way, that would be so awesome. Project X Zone, but it's just Nintendo characters. That would be sick. So the TLDR on all of that, Arc System Works had a leak. 2 games got leaked from that. Project Watari, which is supposedly an Unreal Engine 5 bigger game, and people are assuming it's a 2D fighter, and that's supposedly releasing in November. And then Project Life is a small visual novel, Hotel Dusk vibes in the art style. We don't know when that's releasing, but it's probably not going to need a big marketing rollout, right? It seems to be a very small game. So now let's try to simulate Nintendo's release schedule and look for gaps to where we could see some new announcements. So obviously we know that June 5th is going to be Mario Kart World, July 17th is going to be Donkey Kong Bonanza, July 24th is going to be Jamboree Switch 2 Edition, and then August 28th is going to be Kirby Switch 2. Those are the dates that are confirmed. Now let's put some dates around that for games that we know are coming out. I think August 14th makes a lot of sense for Dragon Drive. It's 3 weeks after the Jamboree Switch 2 Edition and 2 weeks before the Kirby Switch 2 Edition. And while I don't think Nintendo is going to be too beholden to those Switch 2 editions and give them a lot of runway, I don't think they're going to want to release a Switch 2 edition in the same week as a Switch game, and probably if they can, are going to try to space them out by a week or two. So considering that, I think August 14th makes sense for Dragon Drive, which remember was given a summer 2025 release date, and if we assume it's not coming in July because Nintendo's got 2 releases in that period, it's gotta come out in August. I suppose it could come out in early September, but this feels like an August game for Nintendo. I then got September 18th for Metroid Prime 4. You could argue Metroid Prime 4 is an October game, but I think it makes sense in September. This seems to be a game that's pretty much done, so I think the earlier it can come out, the better and more sensible for Nintendo. September 18th makes sense for me there. I've got October 9th for Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. They did say winter 2025, but if you remember, they did the same thing with Fire Emblem Warriors, and they showed us even less of Fire Emblem Warriors. We at least got gameplay of Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. So I think it's very possible this game comes out earlier than we expect. I'll put it in that early October timeframe, like Fire Emblem Warriors came out in on the Switch. I then think November 13th makes a lot of sense for Pokemon Legends ZA. Pokemon loves to release games in November, and this would give them an opportunity to release a game mid-November and also not push up too close against Thanksgiving and that whole week. So I think the 13th makes sense for Pokemon. And then finally, December 4th for Kirby Air Riders. That gives it a little space after Pokemon, but still gives it a few weeks before Christmas, so we can have a bit of a run up to the holiday season, a bit of a boost in sales from that. So on the screen right now, you're going to see my projected Nintendo Switch 2 release schedule. with the games we know are coming out. But let's talk about those 2 Arc System Works games again and theorize about when those could be coming out. Well, I think a shadow drop makes sense for Project Life. If we assume that this game is close to completion, we did see pictures of it in the leak, which doesn't often happen. I think it could make sense as a shadow drop at a June Direct. Or, if it's not ready yet, a shadow drop at a September Direct or a February Direct. But for fun, let's say it's a shadow drop at a June Direct. I think that can make sense because Nintendo's still got 6 weeks in between Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. And while Mario Kart World can certainly carry a 6-week time period on its own, I think it would make sense if Nintendo had something smaller that they shadow dropped in that time frame. Maybe it's some other Switch 1 game like Yoshi's Woolly World or Metroid Prime 2 and 3. But I think if this Arc System Works 1-hour virtual novel game is ready, it would make a lot of sense to shadow drop here in the June Direct. Even though, if we're assuming Watari gets announced at the June Direct too, that's a lot of Arc System Works for one Direct, who knows, but for fun, let's say it's a shadow drop in June. We think, based off the leaks, that Project Watari is coming out in November. I don't think it would come out late November, because then you're really pushing up against Thanksgiving. That feels like a bad spot for any game to be put in. So I think November 6th makes the most sense. Yes, that is 1 week before Pokemon, but I think you'd rather it release before Pokemon rather than after Pokemon, where it will get incredibly overshadowed. At least if you release it before Pokemon, then it has a little bit of time to garner up interest and breathe before that big game comes out for the Switch. But where does that leave some holes for Nintendo to announce some games, Switch 1 or Switch 2, at the June Direct? Well, it doesn't leave us with much, I don't think. But I do think there are 2 spots that make a lot of sense for Nintendo to drop new announcements in, and that's early September and late October. Early September might not be as strong of a slot as late October, which I really do think is interesting. But in my schedule here, I've got Metroid Prime 4 coming out 3 weeks after Kirby and the Forgotten Lands Switch 2 edition. It's clear Nintendo isn't afraid to put a Switch 2 edition a week after a real release or vice versa, so I could easily see Nintendo dropping some sort of game on September 4th, if, again, I'm correct about Metroid Prime 4 coming out on September 18th, which is just obviously a random guess. I would still give them 2 weeks between Prime 4 and that other game. They could even move Prime 4 back a week to September 25th. That would still give them 2 weeks in between Prime 4 and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, which I said is coming out on October 9th for this exercise. And then the other slot, like I said, is late October, and this is one that I think a lot of people are noticing. Obviously, none of these games are actually dated, but when you start to put together where certain games make sense to be dated, I think a lot of people come to the same conclusion, and that is late October feels like a hole. Obviously, any of these games could go in late October, but it feels like a lot of these games make sense elsewhere. So late October could be the slot for even a big Switch 2 game. If you recall, Mario Odyssey came out in that mid to late October timeframe during the Switch 1's launch year. If it comes out on the 24th, let's say, that would be 2 weeks in between Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment and Project Watari on my little schedule here. You could even move Hyrule Warriors up a week to October 2nd. That would still put it 2 weeks ahead of Metroid Prime 4, and then you would have 3 weeks in between Age of Imprisonment and this mystery October game that we're talking about. The point is, however you slice it, it feels like there's going to be a spot for a game release in October for Nintendo, and perhaps one that is one of their biggest of the year. Now, a lot of people have been theorizing that this could be Luigi's Mansion 4. After all, it's been 3 years since Next Level Games released any sort of game, and the game they did release was about as content dry as you can get, and it'll have been 6 years since Luigi's Mansion 3 in October of 2025. But the big elephant in the room here, of course, is that if Luigi's Mansion 4 was coming out this year for the Switch 2, why would they not talk about it in the Switch 2 Direct? Mind you, the Switch 2 Direct is probably going to stand the test of time as Nintendo's biggest Direct ever. There might not ever be another time where Nintendo has as many eyes on their system and their games as April 2nd, 2025. So why not show off Luigi's Mansion 4, a game that did extremely well on the Switch, in that April 2nd presentation? Well, I think it could make sense for them to withhold that in thinking about the game that closed the Switch 2 presentation, Donkey Kong Country... Donkey Kong Bonanza. Now, it has become a meme over the past few months. of how much Nintendo has advertised Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. They even did a video with the Rizzler promoting the game.
Dude, what are you playing right now?
Oh, I'm playing Donkey Kong Country Returns HD.
What? It's for the Nintendo Switch?
Yeah, it's so fun. We gotta help Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong recover their precious banana hoard from the villainous Tic Tac tribe. Daddy, did you know that there's 80 dynamic platforming levels? It's full of secret surprises and...
That's how hardcore they've gone with this promotion cycle. And it was baffling before April 2nd, but it's clear now why Nintendo was putting so many resources into advertising that game. It's because they wanted to remind us that Donkey Kong is one of their biggest characters, and they wanted to prime us for a new Donkey Kong game early on the Switch 2. I really think Nintendo wants this game to be big, and obviously Nintendo wants every one of their games to sell well, but I think in particular they really want Donkey Kong to be a big thing in the Switch 2 era. He's in the theme park. Again, they've advertised him nonstop for the past half year, and with all of the franchises that seem to be due for a new entry on Switch 2, Donkey Kong was the second one to Mario Kart that got a crack on the system. The last impression on all of us of the Switch 2 before launch is Donkey Kong Bonanza. That's the last thing we saw on that Direct, and it's probably going to be the last presentation before June 5th. But if they had another big announcement in that presentation, whether it closed the Direct or not, it might have overshadowed DK. If instead of having 2 announcements at the end of that Direct, they had 3, and Luigi's Mansion 4 was one of them, that definitely would have overshadowed DK. People still would have been hyped about Donkey Kong, but a lot of the discourse would have been around Luigi's Mansion 4, whose predecessor sold better than Donkey Kong did on the Switch. However, if you hold off on an announcement of a game like Luigi's Mansion 4 until the June Direct, Donkey Kong Bonanza is all of a sudden present in our minds, and it's not going to get overshadowed as much anymore by a big announcement like Luigi's Mansion 4. Maybe we'll even get a dedicated Direct or a trailer for DK Bonanza before the June Direct. And if nothing else, we will get a big trailer for DK Bonanza in that June presentation. So now the worry about overshadowing DK isn't as severe in the minds of Nintendo, I would imagine, because they've done their part to make sure people know about this game and are excited about this game. And now they can drop the bomb that in October, Luigi's Mansion 4 is coming to Switch 2. I still think it kind of makes more sense to just announce it in the April 2nd showcase, but it could also make sense to hold it off to give DK more of a spotlight. And let's not act like Nintendo's afraid to announce a big game in a June Direct and release it a few months later. They've done it 2 years in a row. Super Mario Bros. Wonder was a June announcement to October release, and that game sold like crazy. It's well over 10 million units on the Switch. And then last year, Mario Party Jamboree was announced in June and came out in October as well, and that game is well on its way to selling 10 million units on the Switch. If Luigi's Mansion 4 does the same thing, June reveal to October release, it would follow that same pattern that the Mario franchise has taken for the last 2 years. And you could argue that Luigi's Mansion 4 is the smallest franchise in terms of sales potential of those 3. Those being 2D Mario, Mario Party, and Luigi's Mansion. So yeah, the more that I think about it, the more I think Luigi's Mansion 4 could make sense to be that big holiday game for Nintendo. And it certainly makes the most sense of any of their marquee franchises. I think if it's not Luigi's Mansion, there's not going to be another big game coming to the Switch 2 this fall. But again, even if Luigi's Mansion doesn't make this year, we probably will see games like Project Watari, maybe Project Life, and also a few smaller games for the Switch or Switch 2 in that June Direct. So to answer the question, is the Switch 2's lineup in its first year enough? I think so. Luigi's Mansion 4 would certainly take it over the top and honestly make it compete with that legendary year 1 for the Switch. But even without that, we still are getting a new Mario Kart and a new DK and a new Kirby Air Riders and a few other fun small titles as well. And again, I still think even if it's not Luigi's Mansion 4, we will still get a new Switch 2 game or 2 this year that we don't yet know about. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think the Switch 2's lineup is enough for its first 7 months, or are you hoping there's going to be another game or 2 that we don't yet know about? And if you do think there's going to be another game or 2 that we don't know about, what do you think they're going to be? Tell me in the comments. Is it Luigi's Mansion 4? Is it Project Watari? Is it something else entirely? Let me know down below. But that's all for this video. Make sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, hit that big fat button. Share this video with a friend who might like it or who is interested in the Switch's first 7 months and the games that might come out during it. And with all that said, I'll see you guys in the next one.